Here's the thing about extremely toxic people, if not dangerously toxic people. They will go to crazy lengths to chip away at whatever self esteem you have. Your self concept is the image that you have in your mind. And some of us, for a variety of different reasons, at some point in our lives are more sensitive and more fragile in our self concept. Perhaps we didn't receive the nurturing that we needed or the confidence in childhood or the adolescent years. And so we look to our peer group for feedback. This is normal. We build our self esteem initially from the reflection of our caregivers. And you can see when you speak to a child how they perk up when you tell them something positive about themselves and how they start to internalize it, as even going so far as telling other people, I'm really good at math. I'm really good at listening. And likewise, when you start to tear down a child, they will question themselves. They will wonder if they're an idiot. They might even perform poorly in school because they adopt this mentality that is, if you raise a child telling them that they're stupid and call them names like idiot, even though they might not know what it means at first, eventually they're going to start to think of themselves this way. So, very early on in life, our self esteem is given to us by our caregivers. But sometimes our caregivers come from troubled pasts and don't understand the impact that they're having on the psychology of their children. So as a result, some of us go into adulthood with a shaky self-concept, not ever realizing how wonderful we are and delightful and treasured, because perhaps some people in that group will have never found their soul family, their tribe, people who really appreciated them. Perhaps they're only used to broken relationships with narcissists or extremists or volatile, abusive people, or people who don't actually have their best interest at heart, not in a mutual, reciprocal way. And when we are accustomed to toxic relationship patterns, this sets us up to go into some of our first formative relationships not knowing or being any the wiser. And so we find ourselves in situations that are damaging, that are confusing, that are incredibly painful, sometimes humiliating, and we learn these tough lessons. I learned a tough lesson that took me decades in total summation about what it means for people to be in shadow love, how they can be ruled by their patterns when faced with the opportunity for love. They self-sabotage. Some actually go out of their way to destroy another person consciously, intentionally. Maybe they don't set off to do that at first, but something happens and they flip a switch. And you're left digging the wreckage out of your life, wondering what happened. Not a personal story, but what I observe some of the clients that I work with. And understanding how this dream can morph into a nightmare requires a certain understanding of people's inclinations and psychology and attachment styles. And it's this recipe that I've actually built an entire coaching plan around. You can check out my True Love Masterminds group if you feel called. And so as a result, what I have learned is that there's a certain type of person that hates themselves so much at the core that what they do is get people as best as they can to hate themselves too. And this can be parents with children, this can be in romantic relationships, but it's almost this perverse desire, sometimes conscious, many times subconscious. It's a power game. You can see it. You can see it play out. Because when it works, there's this feeling of accomplishment, satisfaction, pride sometimes, like breaking a horse, but you're breaking a child, or you're breaking a spouse or a lover. And you can see the darkness in people's eyes when they're in a power game like that. And they will stop at nothing to find your sensitivity and your wound of inadequacy, whatever it might be. So you can start off in the relationship having maximal self-esteem, being a person that feels healthy. And what you find is that you're dragged into this arrangement with somebody who very often idealizes you at first. And by the time you get to the discard phase, the way they're talking to you makes your head spin. Where did the contempt come from? Where did the disgust come from? How could we go from being lauded to being worthy of this, disparaged in such brutal and humiliating ways? These are extremes, of course, usually seen with people with personality disorders. And it's helpful to talk about the extremes so we can understand the influences and the factors that underpin some of these behaviors. In some cases, it doesn't always extrapolate. But what I found is that it's a spectrum. When we're talking about the extremes, we're talking about the people that are obviously disturbed. But how obvious is it to us, really? Until we're face to face with them at the ending, facing our demise. Because sometimes they can be quite charming, almost as though their entire persona depends on conning people, getting people to submit and surrender to their desires and their will. And so they can be rather attractive because their persona relies on it. I once knew this person. We were close for a while. And I won't share too many details just to respect their privacy. Everything will be anonymous anyway, but just in case. And this was somebody that I really respected and admired. They were a little ahead on the consciousness expansion journey than me at first. And I saw them as sort of a mentor. And I'll never forget some of the conversations that we had were so illuminating and eye-opening. It changed the way I saw everything. And they had a partner in their life, on again, off again relationship that was very unorthodox. And I did my best to support this friend of mine as best as I could, because sometimes I felt as though they weren't being treated the way that I thought that they deserved to be treated. but their relationship was complicated and unusual, and it seemed to be some type of soul contract. But I didn't really know a lot about soul contracts then. But soul contracts can be messy and tumultuous and very magnetic. And friends and support people and family don't always understand the appeal. And because I wasn't really familiar with how magnetic soul contracts could be, I didn't always understand. But there was one example in particular that I felt was something struck me about it in a really deeply concerning way. I was disturbed, quite frankly, where my friend was rejected for their previous escapades in the bedroom. I'm trying not to get flagged and trying to be PG sensitive here. And they had had a history before meeting their partner. And the partner, for whatever reason, did not approve of their history. I'm not quite sure why. I don't know all of the details. But during the tumultuous nature of their relationship, it became almost this point of denial and point of rejection. And there was something profoundly impacting to my friend where they really internalized it as that there was something wrong with them. And they started looking at mental health issues. They started digging into their history, repressed memories, to try to explain, I think, to themselves why they were broken. And this image of brokenness, because they grew up in a religious family, but they weren't crazy religious. I don't know about the partner, but I got the sense that this was almost a moving target. And I'll explain what I mean a little bit more in a few minutes. It had a feeling to me that it was actually one of these shadow love patterns where the rejection and the discard was already setting in. But instead of taking responsibility for their side, and I had a question if there were other people involved, just based on the way that things were unfolding. And from an outside perspective, it seemed like there might have been, it's not really affairs, it's not the relationship dynamic, but it seemed like they were moving on. And they were in that beginning stage of it. And they were using this excuse to make it not their fault. And this happened to touch a wound in my friend and profoundly impacted them, that they really felt absolutely devastated isn't the right word, but completely unlovable. Like they were broken. And this judgment that came from their partner, they were very, very in love with their partner. And to experience that rejection did something to them that I don't even think I can really encapsulate in words, because it was all of this package, intuitive package, emotional package. And I saw the whole picture of how it impacted them, at least what was shared with me. And all I felt was that it was a low blow, that there was something not adding up about it. So I remember being in a friendship years before this particular friend, and this was like my closest friend, and they were married and they started stepping out on their husband. But the problem was I happened to be friends with the husband, and the husband would call me and I was his shoulder to lean on. And he would literally cry with me on the phone because my BFF was telling him all of these horrible things about him, about how he wasn't attractive anymore and he was terrible in the bedroom and all of the worst things that you could tell somebody, never actually saying that they had met somebody else, never actually coming clean about the fact that they were already feet first into an affair. And instead, they put all of the rejection on this friend, this mutual friend of mine that broke him. It broke him for a long time. And I felt that there was an injustice there because it seemed to me that it was wrong at a very deep level to shift the blame like that while you were stepping out. And now, fast forward even more years into the future, even past the most recent friend that I was telling you about. And I came face to face with another variation of this pattern where I was dating somebody. It was a brief courtship. I was getting to know them, and I could tell that they were in their shadow. So I was assessing the situation, and it was a soul contract, an important one, very actually important. And it was relatively early, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back for me personally, because it revealed just how pathological they really were. So we had met very serendipitously, and we had a mutual friend that didn't introduce us, but as we were getting to know each other, we were like, "Oh, you know so and so? Well, that's crazy. Yeah, I know so and so too. Oh, really? Oh, that's amazing." And throughout our conversations, at first, they spoke kindly of this mutual friend, and this mutual friend is somebody that I liked. They weren't perfect. They were in their shadow too. And apparently there was some drama that happened between my partner at that time and the mutual friend. I had nothing to do with it. And when my partner was starting to go through the discard phase, they recounted a conversation to me that I absolutely knew was a lie for two reasons. And they said something very vulgar that I'm going to try to reword a little bit. Anybody that's got some ears around. But they said, "Yeah, I never told you this when we were first talking about this mutual friend, but they confided in me about you." I was like, "Okay, about what?" I said, well, she's a big girl, but she knows how to F. And I was like, "What?" Okay. You don't know me, do you? You actually don't know me because I was thin when I knew that person, and I was deeply spiritual and was not a uh, person that just gave myself away. I have had times like that in my past. I have no shame about it, actually. But that time point where I knew that person, they knew a completely different side of me. And it was almost as though they were trying to fat shame me, which I had also developed a positive body relationship. So that didn't strike home. And I was on the high end of normal of the BMI, which was ludicrous in of itself. They come from a culture where women are expected to be rather thin and waif-like and to please, very misogynistic, to please their men by eye. And if their men were not happy with their fitness or their body type, then it was the woman's responsibility. So he was giving that to me. which didn't affect me. And it also showed me that he was trying to come in between myself and my friend, who I never heard speak poorly about anybody, even when he should have. In fact, I apologized to said friend for speaking badly about somebody else in his presence, because I could tell it deeply upset him. And I was in the wrong, and I needed to go and talk to that person about my problems. I was in my shadow. And I corrected myself, and I went and I talked to that person. And I told them I disliked them, and that I had reservations about them. And so this is somebody that I had a private conversation with about talking about people behind their back, and knew deeply that this friend of mine was not that type of person to say things like that, period. Much less inaccurate things that didn't actually add up. Almost as though my pathological partner at the time put some thoughts together as if he was trying to poke holes in my self-esteem. For what reason? Because he's pathological. Because when we are in shadow love patterns, just like the guy friend that I had, whose wife was starting to cheat on him, and he felt her pulling away, and he had questions. She blame shifted everything and made him feel like he was the problem. And perhaps there was some truth to some of those things. And perhaps not, because she seemed pretty happy for a long time until she met somebody else. And as a result, what people do when they are blame shifting is they are taking that self-hatred and giving it as a gift to somebody else through their rejection, through their admonishment, through their humiliation. And they're taking that self-concept inside, which, if it happens to be weak at all, or shaky, or fragile, or susceptible, for whatever reason, it works. And what that does is it creates self-rejection inside. And I found that it shifts the power in relationships. Imagine for a moment when I was with that soul contract partner who was pathological, imagine that actually affected me, as opposed to revealing something to me about how I needed to get out as soon as possible from that relationship, because it was beyond repair. It was a line. There was a line crossed. That was it. There was no more questions. It was done. Imagine, though, that I was back in my shadow decades before, and that hitting me, there would be a power over me, like a yoke. I might even start going to the gym. I might even start being self-conscious about what I look like or what I'm eating, all to try to keep the interest of this partner who is destructive as hell. Long line of destructive relationships. And imagine me fawning after somebody like that, because I hadn't done the personal work, or I hadn't had the experience yet to understand what was actually going down. People in their shadow, when they have this shadow pattern, like to dominate. And even though it's not overt, there can be a perverse pleasure in watching somebody flail to please you. And what it seemed like to me is that when my friend was being chastised for her vivaciousness, and perhaps she had problems with that side of herself, accepting and loving that side of herself. Perhaps it created problems in her life. She was not the most balanced person at that time that we were friends. And imagine that she hadn't done any healing work. And she took that to heart, that she should continue to reject that part of herself. And now imagine it playing out. And the breakup does eventually come, and so does the other person. And imagine her being shattered to pieces because she didn't understand early on what was really going down. Sometimes when people are really in their shadow, they don't know how to be honest. They don't know how to say, my feelings have changed. I'm sorry. It's not you. I've met somebody else. And instead, they make their physiology about you, their desire about you. They don't take ownership for the person driving their avatar. It's like that pathological partner had problems also in the bedroom because he was addicted to watching movies online. So addicted that he literally couldn't stop touching himself. He could barely go like 10 minutes. And so imagine taking that addiction, giving it to somebody else, saying, you're the problem because your BMI is at the top end of normal. Sorry, honey. No, because when it's a moving target, I mentioned I'd get back to this. Guess what? You lose the weight. And then what happens? It becomes about something else. That is why this pattern is particularly, and I don't like to use the word evil. It's a little dramatic, but it's true. It's evil.